speaking of the give and take and of the Renaissance, there often a criticism is made of rationalism, and particularly political rationalism, as a practice that enables oppression and marginality, something that does not recognize that people have faith and people respond to calls to faith because they are oppressed. And so how if we want to build a political project of rationality or rationalism, how do we respond to that criticism? How do we engage with it?
I think that accusation is made very often of science, really, not of rationality. Because if you look at the movements for scientific temper or rationality in India, they have, I think, been very cognizant of the complexities of India's social systems, of the enormous amount of oppression that is part of India's social systems, but also the constant sort of confrontation that has had with that people have had with the state in terms of either in terms of protecting their land or their forests or a whole host of other things, right? And I think that recognition is also of the fact that a lot of people do not have the agency to necessarily overcome what is quite clearly obscurantism, but is sort of, dressed up as this really part of cultural practice and tradition, right? For example, things like women sitting outside the house during menstruation. Would you call that a cultural practice? Would you call that based on superstition? This entire notion of purity that is assigned to the menstruation, and we've seen this in the context of Sabrimala, the discussions around Sabrimala and temple entry. Women of menstruating age are not allowed in the temple, and that is across temples or places of worship, all over the country. It's not just Sabrimala. It's sort of Sabrimala becomes the big example because there's a Supreme Court verdict about it. But then do we say that this is part of cultural practice? And there has been a tendency to do this about things like sati, for example, right? To say that, this is part of India's tradition and culture. And if you simply oppose it, it is this thing. And if you look at all kinds of superstitious practices, there is, I think, great evidence that most of them, if not all, are inherently discriminatory. Okay? And, and this, I think the rationalist movements in this country have been cognizant of this. It's not as if they have not been cognizant of it. They have, in fact, therefore, always qualified their political project by saying that, by distancing themselves from the pro-establishment sort of defenses of science, right? In terms of either wanting to build the nuclear bomb or anything else. So I think that there is a distinction to be made here, and we should be cognizant of that distinction. Whether they have proactively taken this on, the discriminatory aspect of religion, maybe not. And I think that there is in the science movements itself, there is a need to be much more self-reflective about our history and what we have done and what the shortcomings have been. But have rationalist movements not been cognizant of it? I don't think so. So, but science is often held responsible for this kind of for supporting marginality and or perpetuating oppression. And that is because I think science is seen as this sort of something that is removed from society, that is practiced in scientific institutions, most often institutions that are exclusive, that are not diverse in terms of in India specifically, in terms of caste, definitely, and also in terms of gender, and that also in some sense try and promote the agenda of the state. And the state is the sort of is characterized by its support base, which is largely capitalist, and in the case of India, also by pre-modernity to a large extent, because the hold of feudalism is not completely gone. So in that sense, I think that accusation is made of science, and sometimes it is conflated with, very often, in fact, it is conflated as an attribute of science itself. And that's why this sort of, confusion, I think, arises, that you think of rationality and reason itself as being anti-people and anti-people's understanding and people's knowledge. But I think the problem is of the social and political and economic system rather than an attribute of science itself.
So we must analyze these things as separate, even if related phenomena. So the practice of science in this country as it is done in its institutions, rationality and reason itself, and the rationalist movement. So these are three separate strands, and they cannot be conflated in the way they are. So you talked about how the practice of science in India is often very exclusionary and really insular. And I suppose that is both the cause for and the effect of the fact that we don't have much of a popular culture of science in the country. So, do you think that's true? Do you agree with that statement? And what can we do to start building that sort of culture if it does not exist? Can we think of organizing politically or voluntarily around the question of building a popular culture for science?
No, so I would qualify that a little bit by saying that it's not as if the history of the development of science and scientific institutions in this country has always been or has been problematic in total, right? I think there have been strands. If you take the scientists themselves have tried to propagate the cause of rationality and reason in society by speaking about the problems that exist, the irrationalities that exist in society that are discriminatory socially. So you have had this, but even these scientists, like you take Pushpa Bhargav, who passed away recently, for example, and his sort of attempt to develop the Society for Scientific Temper was also frustrated by his fellow scientists not being willing to sign on to this thing. But they did manage to get in this in the constitution, right? This duty of every citizen to develop scientific temper. So there have been attempts to do this, but I think what is required, to build a popular movement against this, I think is in the first instance the need to call out the blatant irrationalities that we see in society. One cannot talk about science or science education. If you take, for example, some of the critiques of the March for Science, right, that were seen as march by scientists simply because their funding was being cut under the current ruling dispensation. But if you actually look at the kind of debates, discussions that were going on within this entire the March for Science movement, as well as the both globally as well as in India, and specifically in India, I think there is also a reflection about diversity within our institutions. There's a reflection about the need to bring these debates into our institutions, and we see examples of that happening. There has been some progress, if not adequate, in the form of increasing diversity in science institutions. The number of women, for example, in science institutions has increased over the last 3 decades, and diversity in terms of caste has also increased over the last few decades. However, it is undeniable that these remain still dominated by a certain class, caste, gender, in our country, and that therefore, in some sense, does restrict the kind of debate that is allowed in some of these institutions. But I think it is necessary for us to be able to going back to this entire issue of the blatant irrationalities in our society, and caste being one of the biggest ones. I think that we need to call it out for the irrationality that it is. And I think it cannot be done by simply falling back on glorifying superstition and glorifying obscurantism as practices of the people, right? It is, I think, because it defeats the entire purpose of calling out some of these things as irrationalities, right? And it is, given that your social hierarchies are completely unnatural. They are unnatural in the sense that they are not borne out by any kind of genetic superiority, is not borne out by science, is actually now also quite clear. So it's not, and so the fact that something that is cultural is therefore good, I think is something that needs to be opposed quite strongly, and science movements, I think, need to take this on quite strongly. And I think the people who were assassinated, Comrade Pansare, Gauri, Lankesh, Dr. Dabholkar, definitely all of these people have, in some sense, taken cognizance of this fact. It's if you look at the writings of Gauri Lankesh, for example, there is a very strong position against the discriminatory nature of religion and the issue of caste in society. Comrade Pansare, in every one of his talks, actually, did and writings did address this issue of India's social system. Right? So I think that legacy has to be strengthened. That aspect of our movements has to be strengthened and taken forward. And in fact, the fight for the annihilation of caste, the fight for gender equality, and the fight for scientific temper are naturally in sisterhood, right? They're not naturally opposed. They should not be seen as such. And I think that confusion arises from the fact of confusing a political system that is exclusionary as an attribute of science. The fact that science is, and technological development is currently controlled by those who appropriate it for private profit is a narrative that we need to break. Think it belongs to the people. Science belongs to the people. Technology belongs to the people. It has been built by the labor of the working masses, and therefore it is ours to claim. It is not of a private corporation to claim. So let us fight those corporations. Let us not fight science and technology.